So after the hindbrain, we have the midbrain. That's this small section right here. All right, so it sits between the forebrain and the hindbrain. It's only 2 centimeters long, so that's really small. All right, so if anyone have any clue how long 2 centimeters is? Does anyone know how long an inch is? An inch is 2.54 centimeters. Therefore, 2 centimeters is just under an inch. If you don't know how long an inch is, it's usually from one knuckle to another knuckle, like on your index finger. Um, on average, obviously, people have different lengths fingers, but that's roughly an inch. So 2 centimeters is a little bit less than that. And so what's going on here, it's the midbrain is primarily involved with visual and auditory processing. And you'll see that when we talk about the specific parts of the midbrain. The forebrain structure, all right, so the outside. You get the thalamus, which we kind of talked about, is right here. You have the limbic system, right, which is the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. And then you have the cortex, which is the foldy thing on the outside of your brain. So you see how these things fold in here? That would be your cerebral cortex. And I will go into depth about each of those parts of the brain. First, let's talk about the thalamus. All right, so this processes and integrates information from all the senses except for smell and relays information to the appropriate higher brain centers. That's very important, right? So it's kind of like a relay station in your brain. It processes all your senses, right? All your five senses go to your thalamus, and then your thalamus says what part of the brain needs to process that information. So it processes most information to and from higher brain centers. Right, it goes to the thalamus, and then it might go to the occipital lobe if it's visual, or your visual cortex. If it's touch, then maybe it goes to your sensory cortex. So kind of think about your thalamus kind of like a post office where it's taking incoming messages and then delivering it to where it needs to go. So key thing about thalamus, processes all of your senses except for smell. Make sure you know that, all right? Processes all of your sensory information except smell. So the limbic system is made of the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. Make sure you remember that. One of the FRQs tends to be on the limbic system. And these are the three parts that you'll be tested on. So your hypothalamus is that little peanut-shaped thing right there. Your amygdala is this little almond-shaped green thing. And then your hippocampus is this wishbone thing. And we'll go into more depth on that. So first, let's talk about your amygdala. All right, so your amygdala, like I said, is that almond-shaped structure involved in emotion and memory. All right, so key thing about your amygdala, make sure you know it's the emotional center of your brain. Right, it deals primarily with fear and aggression because those, some of your main emotions. But make sure you know it's your emotional center of your brain. Also deals with memory. So a lot of, you have your main memory part of your brain, the hippocampus, which we'll talk about in a second. But a lot of other parts of your brain deal with memories as well. One of the reasons the amygdala is a key part of memory, because think about whenever something happened to you that's extremely emotional, you tend to remember it more. And that's why we found that the amygdala, emotions and memories go together. So the amygdala is the emotional center, but it also deals with memory because of those strong ties with emotions and memories. So let's see if we can do this. What I want you to do is try to identify the emotion from facial expression. It plays a role in fear and aggression. So what emotion do you think this person has? Shock is a common one. What about now? I don't think constipated is a emotion. It's a common answer though. Maybe frustration. What do we see here? Maybe happy. What about her? Angry, frustrated, all common answers. What about this guy? Maybe he doesn't have an emotion. So what you just did by identifying all these emotions, you are using your amygdala. If you had damage to your amygdala, it would make this task very difficult. All right, so there's an article we can read where there's a rare disease where some people don't have any fear at all. So there's, damage to the amygdala, and they wouldn't be able to do that, right? So they'd have a very low EQ, something we're going to talk about later, which is emotional intelligence, right? So emotional intelligence is being able to control your own emotions, right, which your amygdala does, but also, read other people's emotions, something, that you need to do, and your amygdala plays a key part in that. So if you have damage to your amygdala, you wouldn't be able to do what you just did right now. The next part of the limbic system is the hippocampus. Very easy. It helps us form new memories. All right, so this is the key part of your brain that helps you form new memories. Have you ever seen 50 First Dates? Drew Barrymore, Adam Sandler. If not, in that movie, she gets in a car crash and she has damage to her brain. I don't know, it doesn't mention this in the movie, but I assume she had damage to her hippocampus because every day she wakes up and she thinks it's the same day, which is her birthday. All right, so her brother and dad buy her 1,000 copies of the same newspaper, same cake, same everything, because she keeps reliving that day. So she must have had damage to her hippocampus because she can't form any new memories. All right, so it's kind of weird at the end when, she marries Adam Sandler and wakes up with a stranger next to her every day. Of course, in the movie they, make a home video so she can wake up and see who this guy is, and hopefully the memories come back, not waking up to some stranger. The hypothalamus. Hypothalamus does a ton of things, right? Very important part of your brain. Right? This peanut-sized structure that maintains homeostasis, links the endocrine system to the brain, and is involved in motivation and emotional drives, which we'll do a whole unit on later. Right? It also provides those pleasurable feelings for doing the things that keep our species alive, which we'll talk about in a second. All right, one way to remember the hypothalamus, so it does a ton of different things, is it's involved in the 4 F's: food, flight, fight, and fornication. All right, if you don't know what fornication is, bullet point number 1. Sexual behavior. All right, those pleasurable things that keep our species alive. So one of the things that it helps keep homeostasis also, which is just balance, right? Which is just balance. So that's your hunger and thirst. So that's the food part of it. So if you're hungry, thirsty, we'll go into more details about the different parts of the hypothalamus later on with the motivation emotion unit. So we'll talk about the motivation of hunger. You have the ventromedial hypothalamus and lateral hypothalamus, which one part brings on hunger and one part depresses hunger. It controls your sleep. So during your sleep unit, we'll talk about this as well. So your hypothalamus, like if your brain sees light, which is the hypothalamus would be processing this, it tells your brain you should be awake. If it sees dark, you should be sleeping. So depending on how much sleep you got, if you were sleep deprived and you were in a dark room, you would sleep maybe 14 hours straight. If you were in a very bright room, it would tell you to wake up. That's what like Vegas does, right? It pumps the casinos, makes them very bright, pumps them full of oxygen. So you might walk out at 7 a.m. the next day and you thought it was midnight because your brain's telling you that you should be awake. Another thing the hypothalamus does is water and salt balance, right? That's that homeostasis I was talking about. It's all about being balanced. Same thing with body temperature regulation, right? Maintain your normal body temperature. Once again, that's balance, homeostasis. Also plays a role in hormone secretion, and you'll see why in just a second. So the hypothalamus, known as the pleasure center of the brain, it actually became known, we call it now more the reward center. It's a little bit more PC than pleasure center of the brain. And what they did was to measure this, they hooked a rat with an electrode up to its hypothalamus. And every time it would touch this pedal, and there would be one on both sides, so there'd be one over there. And every time it touched this pedal, the hypothalamus would receive a stimulation, right? And so, the hypothalamus is your pleasure center. So anytime you do something that feels good, it's your hypothalamus that's kind of being dinged, right? So if you eat something, so anything you do in your life that feels good, that's your hypothalamus going off. That's why we get addicted to things. Anytime something gives you pleasure, whether it's drugs, chocolate, whatever, it's your hypothalamus going off. So this rat is actually hooked up, with an electrode to its hypothalamus. So every time it touches this pedal, you get the rat would get this electrical impulse, and it would get this pleasurable feeling. Well, what they did, they put this electric grid here, and it would actually get electrocuted. It would cross this electric grid, get electrocuted, electrified a little bit, a little shock to press that pedal, and then it wouldn't give it another electric or sensation to the hypothalamus until it went back over to this side, and then it would go back and forth. So it had to cross that grid to receive a shock, the pleasure, the stimulus to the hypothalamus until it crossed that grid. But every time it did, it received a shock. So how often do you think the rat pressed the lever in an hour? Remember, it had to go back and forth crossing the electric grid. How many times? 10? 100? 1,000? Well, that rat actually passed over that electric grid more than 7,000 times until eventually it just collapsed from exhaustion. It had too much pleasure. It couldn't do it anymore. But it's crazy. So you can kind of understand why people get addicted to things. Because every time they do something that gives them pleasure, their hypothalamus is going off. They get this good feeling. So that's why they want to keep doing it. And it could be anything, right? Like I said, it could be food, it could be drugs. But every time you do that, you get this feeling, and you want that feeling again. So that's why you keep repeating whatever it is you are doing. And I will post that video of the footage of the rat going back and forth on the playlist. The pituitary gland. So sometimes called the master gland of the endocrine system, right? Because it's a system that controls all your hormones. Controls the function of other endocrine glands. No larger than a pea, so really small, and it's actually attached to the hypothalamus by nerve fibers. So that's when I mentioned a second ago on how the hypothalamus controls your hormones. So it's connected to the pituitary gland, which is the master gland, which controls all the hormones. So that is why, that's the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So as you're going to notice, it has a lot of different functions. It deals with growth, right? So it controls your growth. So some people, if you've seen some of those people that get to be like really big, like 7.5 feet tall, 8 feet tall, some of them, not necessarily all of them, but I know there was a kid out in California a few years ago. He was like 7.5 feet tall. He's only 18 years old. And what they found out was he actually had a tumor on his pituitary gland. So normally, we have our pituitary gland. It tells us to grow, to stop growing. Well, that tumor kept secreting, the stuff, and it was like, you need to keep growing, growing, growing. It never stopped it. So that's why he was growing so much. So the only way to stop it was actually to have surgery to remove that tumor. Otherwise, that person might have never stopped growing. The other thing the pituitary gland deals with is blood pressure, sexual reproductive organs, water regulation, metabolism, and temperature regulation. All right, so as you can see, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are extremely busy and extremely important to your bodily functions.